Yeah, he's up now.
I'm going to call the meeting to order. It's October 2nd, 2017. Roll call, please.
Mayor Crawford.
Here.
Commissioner Blanchard.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Hodges.
Here.
Commissioner Ryan.
Here.
Okay. If we'll all stand, those who can, we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance and have a moment of silence. And please remember the families and the people in Las Vegas and Puerto Rico. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Awards and proclamations.
Item 3.1, the month of October 2017 is National Arts and Humanities Month in the City of Salina. Brad Anderson, Director of Arts and Humanities, will read the proclamation.
You don't look like Brad. Would you give your name?
Hi, I am CJ Hammond, Vice Chair of Arts and Humanities Commission.
All right. Thank you.
Whereas the month of October has been recognized as National Arts and Humanities Month by thousands of arts and cultural organizations, communities, and states across the U.S., as well as by the White House and Congress for more than 30 years. Whereas the arts and humanities enhance and enrich the lives of every American. Whereas the arts and humanities play a unique role in the lives of our families, our communities, and country. Whereas the arts and humanities embody much of the accumulated wisdom, intellect, and imagination of humankind. Whereas the nonprofit arts industry strengthens our economy by generating $135 billion in total economic activity annually, $22.3 billion in government revenue, and by supporting the full-time equivalent of 4.1 million jobs. Therefore be it resolved that I, KJ Crawford, Mayor of the City of Salina, do hereby proclaim October as National Arts and Humanities Month in Salina, Kansas, and call upon our citizens to celebrate and promote the arts and culture in our nation, and to specifically encourage the greater participation by our citizens to take action to support the arts and humanities in our community.
Okay. Do you have any special activities going on this month?
I am Stacy Ash, Arts Education Coordinator for Salina Arts and Humanities. And during the month of October, we will be doing daily posts on social media highlighting arts and humanities subjects all month long from a variety of staff, arts commissioners, and other community members. First Friday Night Live, weather permitting, will have its last Campbell Plaza concert of the season with Taylor Klein and Company. And we will also have a roving saxophone artist, Brett Maltby, that will be playing during the Art Walk. New artists networking space called Spark. Artist Resource Exchange will open later this month in downtown Salina. New professional developed programs for local and regional artists will be announced later this month and very early in November. The Arts and Humanities Commission is engaged in conversations about where and how to reach underserved and disadvantaged populations in cultural arts programs and opportunities. Radio Kansas will be broadcasting live from the lobby of the Smoky Hill Museum on Friday from 1:30 to 4. Slim will be installed on the Southwest Plaza of TPEC. I'm not sure what that is. That's the Tony's Pizza. Oh, the Tony, of course. Tony's Pizza Event Center later this month, Slim being an artwork. Volunteers will help clean sculptures in the public collection on Saturday as part of the Fall Fix-Up. Volunteers will... the Smoky Hill Museum will be hosting a series of community conversations about racial stereotypes as part of their current exhibition, Sorting Out Race, examining racial identity and stereotypes in thrift store donations, as well as arts education, arts infusion program through Salina Arts and Humanities. Will have Oil and Spiegel Puppet Company on October 17th and 18th in USD 305 schools. And then on October 24th and 25th, we will have the Artist Outreach out of Texas doing Geo Dance, which is putting together math and art.
Sounds like you're going to be real busy. Would you like to have your proclamation? If you'll come forward, I'll give you a proclamation. Thank you for the good job you do. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Crawford, Commissioners. My name is Owen Freiberger. I am past chair, I was about to say chair of the Planning Commission and currently vice chairman. We also have a proclamation for you. Community Planning Month proclamation. Whereas change is constant and affects all cities, towns, suburbs, counties, boroughs, townships, rural areas, and other places. And whereas community planning and plans can help manage this change in a way that provides better choices for how people work and live. And whereas community planning provides an opportunity for all residents to be meaningfully involved in making choices that determine the future of their community. And whereas the full benefits of planning requires public officials and citizens who understand, support, and demand excellence in planning and plan implementation. And whereas the month of October is designated as National Community Planning Month throughout the United States of America and its territories. And whereas American Planning Association and its professional institute, the American Institute of Certified Planners, endorse National Community Planning Month as an opportunity to highlight the contributions sound planning and plan implementation make to the quality of our settlements and environment. And whereas the celebration of National Community Planning Month gives us the opportunity to publicly recognize the participation and dedication of the members of the Planning Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals, Heritage Commission, and Lee District Design Review Board, and other citizen planners who have contributed their time and expertise to the improvement of the city of Salina. And whereas we recognize the many valuable contributions made by professional community and regional planners of the city of Salina, Saline County, and the North Central Regional Planning Commission, and extend our heartfelt thanks for the continued commitment to public service by these professionals. So be it resolved that the month of October 2017 is hereby designated as Community Planning Month in the city of Salina in conjunction with the celebration of National Community Planning Month, once signed by Mayor Crawford.
Okay, and do you know if there are any particular activities?
We meet the first and third Tuesdays of every month, so we'd love to have your participation at board meetings. We also have October 17th coming, which is the Planning Commission Tree Advisory Board Landscaping Awards. So that's an annual event that we enjoy very much. So again, I'll ask you to be here October 17th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. October 19th and 20th is the State Planning Conference. This is very exciting. We'll have that in Salina this year, and it's hosted by the Salina Hilton Garden Inn.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'll give you your proclamation.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
We can take note of that.
My name is Abby Hunter, and I am the Domestic Violence Victim Advocate at DVAC. We would like to proclaim October Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Whereas family and relationships are often counted among life's greatest blessings, and tragically, many Kansans' relationships are tarnished by violence and fear. Whereas the crime of domestic violence violates an individual's privacy, dignity, security, and humanity due to the systematic use of physical, emotional, sexual, psychological, economic, and coercive control or abuse. Whereas the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime, which translates to approximately 44 million people nationally and 621,000 people in Kansas. Whereas the Kansas Bureau of Investigations reports that 22.9% of all homicides in Kansas in 2015 were related to domestic violence. Where in Kansas in 2015, 1 domestic violence murder occurred every 12 days, 4 hours, 48 minutes. Whereas in Kansas in 2015, 1 domestic violence incident was reported to law enforcement every 23 minutes and 6 seconds. Whereas this violence is inconsistent with the values of our community and will not be excused or tolerated. And whereas, in declaring this month of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we encourage all citizens to speak out against domestic violence, to provide support for survivors of these crimes, to encourage community leaders to hold perpetrators accountable, and to make domestic violence prevention efforts a priority by hosting events, by creating policies at school and work, and by working with your local domestic violence victim service providers.
Go ahead.
Okay, now therefore, the Salina City Commissioners, we ask that you hereby proclaim the month of October 2017 Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Thank you very much. And are you planning any activities?
Yes, we have Monday, October 9th at 8:15 p.m. a candlelight vigil at Kansas Wesleyan. Anyone is welcome. There's usually a prayer, some worship songs, and then we'll hold the candlelight vigil. On Saturday, October 14th, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., we're hosting our big domestic violence awareness event at Jerry Ivy. We'll have free hot dogs, cotton candy, drinks, activities for kids and adults, costume contests, the whole nine. Saturday, October 21st, from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., we're partaking in an I Am Loved conference, is what it's called. It is woman only, and it's at Heartland Worship Center. We're talking about domestic violence and infant mortality and how they work together. Tuesday, October 24th, all day long, we're doing a community-wide clothing drive. And then Monday, October 30th, from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., we're helping with the Coaching Boys into Men, and we're going to be talking about domestic violence. That'll be at the Salina Fieldhouse.
Okay, sounds like you've
Yes.
got a very busy month.
Yes,
and
we
I have
do.
your
And
proclamation for you.
I have the flyers, if any of you would like flyers.
Very good. I would like
It's
a
a nice
flyer.
little ribbon for you to don.
Okay.
Good, I was trying to type all those dates in my phone.
I couldn't get them all down either.
And I typed to myself, get details.
Yeah.
So thank you.
There you go for your proclamation. And thank you for the hard work. I know it's hard.
Looks like I wore the right shirt today.
No, I didn't get one. Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Got
Thank
one?
you.
Whoops, you don't have one.
It's okay. I can't
that's
attend
his.
the women's all day.
That's
Thank
his.
you.
Okay, we're down to the Citizens Forum. Is there anyone here who would like to bring any issue to the commission for action or anything that is not on the agenda? Apparently not. Okay, we'll go on down. There are no public hearings or items scheduled for a certain time. We'll go on down to item 6.
Item 6.1, approve the minutes of September 25th, 2017.
Okay. Are there any commissioners that want to pull or have any comment on the particular minutes that were, if not, I'll
Madam Mayor, I
accept
move we approve the minutes of September 25th.
Okay, a motion and a second to approve the minutes of September 25th, 2017. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Okay. Administration?
Item 7.1, first reading ordinance number 17-10902, amending Salina Code sections 8-1-1-2902.1 and 8-1-3-422.1 pertaining to minimum plumbing facilities.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mayor
Good
Crawford
afternoon.
and Commissioners. I'm Sean Pilcher, interim building official. On April 1, 2017, the 2012 IBC, IRC, IECC, UPC, and UMC, and 2011 NEC, a lot of acronyms there, codes went into effect. Numerous committee meetings and discussions were held by the BAB and local contractors, and it was decided not to adopt the entire international code family, but rather continue using the plumbing and mechanical codes. On July 31st, 2017, Jeff Mays with Compro Realty submitted a local code amendment request for the consideration of the Building Advisory Board. The request stated as follows. We would like to request the 2012 UPC code be amended to reflect the 2012 IPC code, switch to the international code, requirements relative to fixture plumbing count. The request goes on to say the new code requirements are placing undue hardship on new construction projects in the community. In some cases, the new requirements are making lots previously purchased by owners undevelopable entirely under the new requirements. National tenants are coming to the community unable to build buildings that they are able to be built all over the state, all over the Midwest, but not in Salina due to the requirement. Table 422.1 in the Uniform Plumbing Code, that's the table for minimum fixture requirements, is more conservative than the International Building Code table. It requires more fixtures in most cases for most occupancies, or for a lot of occupancies. The 2012 UPC training manual cites studies by the American Society of Plumbing Engineers and the Stevens Institute in order to justify the higher numbers in the table. They talk about potty parity for gender equality, having more restrooms for female in female restrooms. Since the adoption of the 2012 Uniform Plumbing Code in April, there have been 3 applications for new construction projects submitted to Development Services that were erroneously designed to the 2012 IPC rather than the UPC, Qdoba, Pepper Jacks, and Ulta Beauty. All 3 required increases in their fixture counts that they found challenging, but all 3 were ultimately able to comply with the UPC table and their projects moved forward. Permits were issued and construction was completed. If you look in your packet, there's a table in there that it's a comparison of some of those and a couple more, including the proposed Popeyes project that shows a comparison of what the UPC requires and what the IBC requires. And you can see that it's a little bit higher in the UPC. The Building Advisory Board met August 8th, 2017 to consider the code amendment. At the full BAB meeting, there was discussion of the potty parity issue, and there appeared to be general consensus that an amendment might be appropriate with details of the amendment to be recommended by a subcommittee. On August 15th, 2017, the subcommittee met. At that meeting, they opted not to amend the table. A motion was made to deny the request and continue using Table 422.1 out of the Uniform Code. The motion passed 4-0. At the September 12th subsequent Building Advisory Board meeting with the full board, the board considered the recommendation of the subcommittee and passed a motion 5-4 recommending denial of Mr. Mays' request to keep Table 422.1 of the Uniform Plumbing Code as written and adopted. Staff has identified the following options for City Commission's consideration. Number 1, if the Commission concurs with the Building Advisory Board's recommendation to deny Mr. Mays' request, a motion should be made to deny the request and amend Sections 8-1-1-2902.1 and 8-1-3-4221 of the Salina Code relating to minimum plumbing facilities and replace Table 422 of the UPC with a new table that would be in line with plumbing fixture count requirements of 2902.1 of the IBC. There's a lot of numbers in there. But if the Commission does not agree with the recommendation of the Building Advisory Board and wishes to adopt the amendment, a motion should be made to adopt ordinance number 17-10902 on the first reading, which amends sections 8-1-1-29021 and 8-1-3-4221 of the Salina Code relating to minimum public facilities to replace Table 422.1 of the UPC with the new table that would be in line with the plumbing fixtures requirement of Table 2902.1 of the IBC. I believe that those tables are in your packet as well for comparison, but I can answer questions if you have them. Number 3, the City Commission could also choose to postpone consideration of the action to a specified date with direction from City Commission staff resulting in the 2012 Uniform Plumbing Code Table 422.1 remaining in effect until or unless additional action is taken at a later date. Staff supports the recommendation of the Building Advisory Board and recommends option number 1. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. That's a lot
questions?
of acronyms and jargon there.
Not so much a question, just want to make sure I have it correct. If we concur with the advisory board's recommendation to deny the request, then as an example, the female restrooms in these restaurants would increase compared to the
Right, well, they would stay the same, but if
Well,
you...
for new construction, I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
okay.
Mr. Pilcher, I guess I would ask, Mr. May says that, that the new requirements are making lots previously purchased by owners undevelopable entirely under the new requirements. Are you aware of any projects that have been abandoned because of the new plumbing codes?
No, not at this time. I think the project he was referring to was the one for Popeye's Chicken.
Okay.
And they're still working on that. We have yet to receive plans for that project. We've just had a DRT on that, and there was a little bit of conflict on the number of fixtures that were going to be in there. If you look on that table that we have in there, the occupant load they'd talked about, we have, like I said, we haven't received plans, but in the DRT meeting, the occupant load was 52. For example, if the occupant load is 52, if you divide that in half to figure male and female, and then in the uniform code, it is 0 to 25, you get 1 water closet for females, and then 26 to 50, you get 2 water closets. So if you divide that in half, you're going to get 26. And so 2 water closets would be required there. In the international code, it's 1 per 75. So it would just be 1. But that's the only one that I'm aware of. There hasn't been any that we reviewed that have dropped out.
And I might be able to add a little context to that. In the Popeyes example, it seemed like there were 2 possible solutions. One was to reduce the seating space, which reduces the occupant load and gets to the 50 number and the 1 plumbing fixture, as Mr. Pilcher described, which I think the assumption was that wasn't acceptable to Popeyes because they had a model that they knew what they wanted in the way of dining space and resulting occupancy. So if that's not the case, the other alternative is to expand the footprint of the building to make additional space for the additional fixtures, and the site literally was so tight with required parking and circulation and landscaping area that they didn't feel that was possible either. So I think that's the logic for that assertion.
Look, Mr. Scragg, let me ask you this. As part of your typical, and I'm just going to say typical, that anybody would do due diligence on a project before they bought the property, did the site planning and everything, would they not want to pursue an action like this prior to something like that rather than come back and say, the reason why this project can't move forward is because of an extra toilet or 2? I mean, wouldn't there be the possibility that there are bigger fish to fry on that project, so to speak? No pun intended. I know they're a chicken spot. But
Yeah,
I saw a boo over there. So anyway,
right.
But I mean, it just seems like we're a little bit. It seems like if we're going to place blame on the reason for not going forward on a restaurant is that the code, which everybody knew about, and let me just kind of direct it back to Mr. Pilcher. Mm-hmm. The Building Advisory Board has contractors, master plumbers, everybody, architects, designers, everybody on that board. One of the things that I seem to recall from a study session, I think it was when Jim Brown was still here, in a study session, was we went over this, that we knew that this was going to be a part of it. And was this the part of the code that we particularly tailored to the UPC because the plumbers preferred the UPC over the other code?
That's correct. In the past, Salina was they used the Uniform Plumbing Code, but it was amended to incorporate the International Plumbing Code table. In the last code adoption, they purposefully took that amendment out, so it went by just the uniform table. And that was a major topic of discussion in the meetings, and they wanted that on purpose that way.
Right, and so we tasked through this thing, and am I to assume that the plumbers were on board with this, and the architects were on board with this, and
yes, at that time they were, and the plumbers and the especially the ones on the Building Advisory Board, are still in favor of using the uniform code table.
Okay.
If I may address the due diligence question, I don't know that the due diligence happens before property acquisition, but more typically the due diligence we see is confirmation of the applicable codes here in Salina and then ensuring that you're designing to them. The three examples that Mr. Pilcher cited for unknown reasons turned in plans that were, I mean, I guess I could understand the assumption that we've adopted the entire international family of codes, but by the time they turned in the plans, they had designed them to the incorrect plumbing code. And then I would add, having attended the Building Advisory Board and the subcommittee meeting, there was considerable deliberation about the potty parity issue, and not to be cute, it is an identified issue and concern, and the Building Advisory Board considered kind of whether that was a legitimate issue and whether the studies and the UPC adequately addressed it, and they felt that it had merit.
Okay. I just seem to recall that when we were talking about whether or not it should be rezoned to a planned commercial or commercial, there seemed to be significant, I would say, assurances that this was most likely, I mean, we saw plans of a Popeyes. And so,
right.
I don't know that was their
at
plan,
the applicant's level or staff's level, either one of us were tracking down to the impact of plumbing fixture count at that point. But it was a tight site, so tight that this did, impact the footprint of the building, and I'm not prepared to say that you can't fit on that site and meet the UPC yet.
Right. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, Mr. Pilcher?
Yep.
Bring it back to the commission for action. Thank you, Mr. Pilcher.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I move to deny the request to amend sections 811-2902.1 and 813-422.1 of the Salina Code relating to minimum plumbing facilities to replace Table 422.1 of the UPC with a new table that would be in line with the plumbing fixtures requirements of Table 2902.1 of the IBC.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second to approve on first reading.
What?
Are we right there?
I thought you were
Yes.
concurring with the Building Advisory Board.
That does.
Yeah, that
The
does.
wording may
It
be a little
does.
confusing, but it does.
What?
It does.
That's
option number one.
it's option number 1 on here.
Okay.
That's the reason I asked to make sure that I
Okay.
was
Okay,
That's what I
That
did.
was-
Okay.
it's all right.
flowing, right.
Because when it was said before, it said that you would
Yeah.
agree with
Yeah.
ordinance number.
The ordinance that you've been provided is the ordinance that would be necessary to grant the request and make the change. So the motion to deny is correct, and the description of what we're denying
Okay,
is
because the mayor
requested
was saying
change.
the motion was to approve the
to-
ordinance.
Approve the ordinance of
Yeah, the-
17-10902.
Option number 1 is denying the request to adopt the ordinance. And then the rest of that descriptor is the action that would be taken if you were to pass. It's the summary of the ordinance title.
Right, so on page 3 of the blue sheet.
Right,
Yeah.
So we're not,
okay,
Adopt.
so we're not doing that.
So-
Okay.
Right,
okay.
we're not adopting ordinance 17-10902.
Okay, can you reread what the motion was so that we get this right, make sure we've got it right?
I have to deny the request to amend sections 8-1-1-2902.1 and 8-1-3-422.1 of the Salina Code relating to the minimum plumbing facilities to replace Table 422.1 of the UPC with a new table that would be in line with the plumbing fixtures requirements of Table 2902.1 of the IBC.
Okay, and that motion was seconded?
Yes.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, got that straight.
Some of those are tricky.
They are.
That would set a new
Lots
tongue
of
twister
acronyms.
Yeah, that didn't
standard.
help.
Okay. 8.1.
Item 8.1, consider a request to enter into an outside the city water and sanitary sewer agreement and consent to annexation agreement to allow a proposed indoor shooting range to connect to the city's water and sanitary sewer system.
Mr. Andrew.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. This is a request from Shelley Bigham, doing business, hopefully, as the Center Fire Range and Training Center. And Shelley Bigham and her husband, Mick, have plans to construct a new state-of-the-art indoor gun range to include a pro shop, snack bar, training center on a 4.7-acre tract that's just outside the city limits on West North Street. So this is the tract here. This is North Broadway, the Broadway Viaduct. This is North Street. This is Old Highway 40. This property is, as I mentioned, just outside the city limits. The Bighams met with the city's development review team on April 5th, 2017, and there were 2 items that were discussed at that meeting. There were other items, but these were items of focus. One was that at that time, indoor shooting ranges were not recognized as an allowed use within the city limits of Salina. And the second was the need for potable water for patrons, and also the ability to have fire protection for a 15,000 square foot building. At that time, they indicated that the wells on the property had shown signs of contamination, and they expressed a desire to connect to the city's water system. Back in 2013, Phase 2 of the West Grand, West North Street waterline loop was completed, and there is a 12-inch public water line that runs along the north edge of the proposed gun range site. So there is a public water supply potentially available. So this drawing here indicates this is the 12-inch water line that was extended down West Grand here and then back on North Street to tie back to Broadway, and this is the property in question here. This started out as a request for outside the city water. Then there was some discussion of adding outside the city sewer, but now we're back to only considering water. There has been an indication that an on-site septic system would be installed to serve the shooting range. As justification for the request, the applicant points to the fact that the wells on the property have been tested and show signs of contamination. They're also concerned that an indoor shooting range would be an allowed use under Saline County's zoning, but not under the city's zoning. And so, as long as we're on this drawing here, I misidentified the west and east sides of Old Highway 40, but any event, these 3 properties here are outside the city limits, but they have outside the city water agreements. And at the time that those were done, the city had a policy that was in place for many, many years that required properties served by city utilities to be annexed unless they were industrial uses. And so that's why you have uses like Exide and Phillips Lighting and Crestwood Cabinets that are outside the city limits but are served by city water. These agreements that were done for here, here, and here were all done under that industrial exception from what our research shows us. As I indicated, at this time, indoor shooting ranges are not specifically provided for in the Salina zoning ordinance and are deemed to be prohibited within the city limits. During the summer, staff was contacted by Nathaniel Berg, who represents JRI Investments, and they were looking at the possibility of establishing an indoor shooting range on property they own at Westport Boulevard. They initiated an application and asked for a Planning Commission review to review the ordinance, to review our commercial industrial districts, They asked staff to report on trends within the country about how indoor shooting ranges are classified, and based on that, they indicated that they felt Salina zoning ordinance should be amended to identify indoor shooting ranges as an allowed use within the city, and that they could be approved on a conditional use basis in commercial districts and allowed by right in industrial districts. That amendment has been initiated, but it will not be scheduled for a public hearing until the 17th of October, which would be a Planning Commission public hearing, and then whatever recommendation they come up with would come forward to you for final decision. This property is zoned as IH heavy industrial in the county, and it would most likely, if it were annexed, continue in that same classification, either I2 or I3. So the status that we have now is that it is permitted use under the county zoning, but not under the city zoning. On page 3 of your report, we have summarized the language from the comprehensive plan as relates to the extension of utilities, and one of their recommendations for policies is do not provide services or extend infrastructure to development outside the city that has not been annexed or is willing to consent to annex. And just for your information, by my last count, we had about 14 properties who had had utilities extended to them outside the city limits. Those properties have agreements that allow the properties to be annexed at the City Commission's discretion. At this point, none of those have been exercised. But the fact is that if you have a outside the city water agreement with consent to annexation, then the property owner has consented to have their property annexed at the City Commission's discretion. So the primary reason this is on your agenda this afternoon is that I have struggled to finalize any kind of draft agreement for the Bighams to review and for getting city legal counsel review, because I've not been able to come up with an accurate and complete legal description for this property. And the other item is that any sort of connection to city water, there should be a calculated cost for the party that hooks up, and the agreement generally addresses that, and I have not been able, nor has city staff with Ms. Tasker's help, yet come up with a solid number to say what the proportionate share of the cost of that line would be for this property. So John, if you could go to that cost recovery map. I think it's the other version. At the time that the project was finalized, this was attached to the report when the project was bid, and it was reported to the commission that there would be a cost recovery area set up here, and that these properties, as they desired to hook up to the line, would pay a cost recovery fee, essentially as a hookup charge. And we do not yet have a cost recovery ordinance in place with sufficient time. Looking at the benefiting area, looking at the final costs, and doing an allocation, I think we could get there, but we were unable to get there for today's meeting. The Bighams are very anxious to move forward on their project, and for these reasons, staff has brought this request to you for policy direction. A water service extension agreement would give them some assurance that they could move forward with their project in the county. The consent to annex could be invoked at your discretion, assuming that the zoning text amendment is approved and that the city does wish to annex the subject property. Of course, the alternative to that is to let the zoning text amendment process work its course and see if we end up allowing indoor shooting ranges within the city limits and in what zones. So the options would be to direct staff to prepare and finalize an outside the city water connection agreement and consent to future annexation. And that would be with the current owner, Pestinger Enterprises, and with the operators of the business. Or you could direct them to submit a request to annex the property into the city limits. If the property is annexed, no building permit could be issued for an indoor gun range until and unless the pending text amendment is approved and goes into effect. So this is really a question of timing. I think the Bighams always anticipated that they would begin their project in the county because the county zoning allows for their use, and they don't plan to hook up to city sewer service, but they were anxious to see if they would be able to extend water service to their site based on the proximity of that line. I believe Shelley Bigham is here and can better describe her project. You have her letter in there with the summaries of the reports on the lack of quality water on the site. Certainly from staff's perspective, having the ability to access the city's line for fire protection is a much better option than not having a public water supply for fire protection. But the options at this point are to allow a property outside the city limits to connect through an agreement and consent to annexation, or to direct the applicant to submit a request to annex the property into the city. So with that, I'd be happy to address any questions you have. We've had, Ms. Tasker's not here, but we've had other staff members involved with this, and so any member of staff would be available for questions.
Just a question procedurally. Would it be improper to not necessarily, or to not suggest a request to annex a property be submitted, but instead to just wait for the zoning text amendment process to run its course?
Yeah, that was a question I had for Mr. Andrew. When I look at both of these options, and we can synchronize some of these actions to keep the time, to stay in with the timeline, but in looking at it, I guess the question is wouldn't it be best on either of these two actions to make sure they're coordinated and synchronized with the final approval of the zoning text amendment, or just thereafter?
Well, the primary issue that arose out of the DRT meeting, and because city planning staff anticipated that this would be a county project, we had Mr. Neal attend on behalf of the county, so there wouldn't be confusion about the zoning aspect of this. And so from a question of timing, if the Bighams applied for a building permit to construct this building in Saline County, they could get a building permit for it because it's a permitted use under county zoning. If they submitted that same application and the property was in the city limits, we would have to not act on their application until the zoning text amendment process had run its course.
So the options are, in this case, that they could potentially move forward immediately in Saline County, and then whatever is there at the time of the potential future annexation. Or if we move forward with these two actions, we could theoretically, if the zoning text amendment doesn't go forward as anticipated, or for some reason the zoning action would not include this property, we could either have a property that's on city water, but with an inability or lack of desire at that point to annex it later because of the zoning text, or a property that's annexed into the city already, but which doesn't have a proper zoning category. That means we would have, I suppose, a non-conforming use that we'd have to deal with. And that both of those are assuming that for some reason, and I think it's low probability, but for some reason, the zoning text process, which would happen after these, something would go wrong with it.
You're correct. If we were to issue a permit, and I say we, it's actually the county that would issue the permit, and then the zoning text amendment were not approved, and then we annex this property into the city, we have immediately created a non-conforming situation because we've annexed a use that our zoning ordinance doesn't allow.
And
So-
just for clarity, and Mr. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but to say that they could apply for a building permit in the county today, that's under one of two scenarios. Scenario one would be that they don't have any city water or sewer. They were working off of a well and a septic tank in the county. Scenario two would be they've yet to be annexed into the city, but they have an utility extension agreement with the city such that at least city water, if not both city water and sewer, could be extended to the site. So to say that they can pull a county building permit kind of leaves them with a choice to make.
Then the third scenario is that the zoning text amendment runs its course. The property, they request to annex it into the city. At that point in time, they don't have to request to connect to city water because they're inside the city limits.
Dean, in the county permitting process, they would actually issue a permit even if they don't have either city water or potable water, well water?
That would be subject not on the question of potable water. That would be something that Mr. Neal would have to look at. But the bigger question would be, since we don't enforce our fire code outside the city limits, the question is whether the state fire marshal would approve construction of a building that doesn't seemingly meet the fire code. They have done that before in Salina County, and it's not always predictable what they would do, but it is entirely possible that without the connection to city water, that the state fire marshal may not sign off on a plan to build on this site without a connection to a fire protection supply.
So really two questions. One's the fire supply and the way the state fire marshal's office would handle it, and the other is whether or not the county would look at potable water as a factor in issuing a building permit.
So it is possible under Mr. Scragg's scenario one that if they applied to build this building and all they had was a domestic well and a septic system, it is possible that the state fire marshal may say no because of the lack of fire protection. And then under scenario two, they would be building in the county but have an agreement to be able to connect to city water, which might make the fire marshal more likely to approve the plans. And then scenario three is developing the entire project inside the city limits as an annexed property.
How does the timing of either of the two commission actions coincide with the timing it should take to complete the zoning text amendment?
It does not affect the zoning text amendment. The real question on timing was that staff was not able to get an outside the city water agreement put together in a timely enough fashion. And so we are putting this before the commission today to give direction. If the commission is not supportive of entering into an outside the city connection agreement, then that tells all of us that the only scenario by which this can happen is through annexation.
You said this property is contiguous with the city.
It is contiguous to the city limits.
And the other 14 properties you mentioned, are they outside of the city limits by some distance, or are they contiguous?
Most of the properties that have outside the city water are located out in the south industrial area. Some of those are contiguous, many of them are not. But we have the majority of the 14 properties are not touching on the city limits, but you have Exide, you have Phillips Lighting, you have Crestwood Cabinets, which is contiguous. We have Doug Bradley Trucking, which has outside the city water and is contiguous. But none of those, although they have consents to annexation, have been forcibly annexed by the city commission.
We're paid at a higher rate for the water when it's outside service.
That is part of the agreement, that they pay at 125% of the rate that inside the city limits pay.
And if they're annexed, they'll pay property and sales tax.
If they're annexed, they pay property and sales tax, and then they pay at 100% rate instead of the 125% rate.
Thank you.
I got is there two sets of 14 properties here? Because I'm looking at this, and there's 14 properties in this.
It just so happens
north.
coincidentally that there are 14 existing properties
Okay.
outside the city limits. That all of these
Because they're-
properties here are outside the city limits.
Okay.
And so
I
what,
want to ask you a question about those 14 in particular, and I kind of want to focus, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I want to focus my question on what I see as the most recent request, and that is just for the water service, because what I heard you say is that there is no desire for annexation. So number one would be, if there's no desire to annex, I think it'd be hard to get a consent to annex.
the consent to annex is an automatic part of any city water extension agreement. So
Okay, so in other words, to do any,
we would
we
not
can't
entertain
separate
that.
the two.
Correct.
Okay.
They are
Yeah.
part and parcel with
You
each
wouldn't
other.
want to do that.
And you-
Right.
Right, yeah, I mean, it would create a dilemma for me, so I appreciate that
So-
I'm unable to.
Even in the case of the Webster Conference Center, which was our most recent example, both the Planning Commission and City Commission expressed a desire not to annex the Webster Conference Center. Nonetheless, their agreement that allowed them to hook up to the city's sewer system does consent to annexation, and that is a standard part
Right.
of any extension agreement.
But the consent, obviously, is not ultimate. The policy, the door opening, so to speak, the exemption has been 100% for industrial use, and is that as defined by uses in the...
Usually defined by the zoning ordinance and the SIC code. And
Okay.
so we've had to do an independent analysis of that. In the case of Bradley Trucking, I had to do an analysis and determine that Bradley Trucking fit within the industrial exception, but that policy is 50, 60 years old running. When the 2010 comprehensive plan was adopted, it didn't contain an industrial exception. It just had the language in there that recommended no exceptions to either annexation or consent to annexation,
Okay.
but
And-
didn't
and-
specify uses.
And I just want to try to flesh this out so that I'm able to put the applicant's request on an even an equal footing and a level playing field with what we've done in the past. Let me ask you this. As I read through this packet, what I read is that sort of the best practices that we've been able to come up on this thing is that we would allow as a conditional use a firing range should we look to do it inside the city limits, that it most likely might fit into a commercial district, probably is it C3 up or C, you know what I'm saying? Is it C3 up as a conditional use, but that it may, did I read the packet right to say that there would be a contemplation that I2 and I3, it would be a permitted use?
That is what the proposed text amendment is contemplating, that if you have property that is zoned I2 or I3 and you wish to establish an indoor shooting range, that would be a
Okay.
permitted use. But if you were in a commercial district, perhaps in a multi-tenant center or building, that it would be a conditional use that would be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Help me make the connection on this then. If we don't currently have anything that points to a firing range in the city, we don't have some sort of use to put that on until a planning commission does. But if we recognize the fact that it's best at home in an industrial zone, can I connect the dots and say that the closest relative it has in our zoning plan is an industrial use?
Yeah, I think very possibly, yeah.
Okay. So if I'm playing on an even playing field, do I consider this an industrial use and provide the exception? Or do I say, since it's going to be more customers coming in versus, I mean, I guess I'm getting at, are we
Yeah.
talking industrial as it relates to manufacturing? Are we talking industrial as it relates to number of employees? Or what exactly are we using as
Well,
that?
real quick, though, one thing we have to be a little bit careful of. Individually, it's easy for us, I think, to look at this and say, if we had the zoning question in front of us today, what do we think it might be?
Right.
But in fact, we're ahead of the zoning question as we contemplate that and contemplate that out loud. And part of the trick to this, especially when you think legally, you want to be careful not to prejudge the zoning, even though we all have gone through the same line of thinking of, well, what are the odds that that'll be acceptable with the zoning text amendment later?
But did I make any of these other 14 exceptions?
Yeah. I
that process.
just want to be clear. In no way is, and myself or is city planning staff trying to characterize an indoor gun range as fitting into an industrial exception. We're not.
And I would
we're not
tend
trying to argue
I would tend
that
to
point.
agree with you. I'm just
So,
kind of trying to flesh this out because
Right.
that's
it's
what I've had
probably easier
presented
for
to
us
me.
to have an opinion than you.
Right.
Just so we're clear, the industrial exception was our past practice prior to the 2010 comprehensive plan. The 2010 comprehensive plan no longer recommend that exception was extension of utilities without consent to annexation.
Okay.
The 2010 comprehensive plan indicated that going forward, any extensions should be accompanied with a consent to
And
annexation.
these other ones were 1985 that are on this one.
I will.
And
I will just
2000.
correct that slightly by saying the prior policy did require did not require industrial uses to annex, but it did require that they consent to annexation. So Crestwood has consented to annexation, Phillips Lighting has consented to annexation, Exide has consented to annexation. The city commission has not chosen to forcibly annex them into the city.
So it hasn't always it has, but it hasn't always been the.
Well, I guess a better characterization may be previously a willingness to consider extension of utilities outside the city limits for industrial uses. The comprehensive plan speaks more generally about case-by-case basis consideration and the need for consent to annex when that extension is granted.
Okay.
From a comprehensive plan perspective, whatever path you take, you need to know that you can get to where the comp plan wants you to get. So, for example, if in either of these scenarios, if you don't know and aren't in a position to prejudge the zoning, right now I can tell you. Well, I'll come back to that. If you don't know and aren't in a position to prejudge the zoning, being careful just to follow the line of how you're supposed to think on the zoning, it's possible that under either of these scenarios, you find a path, it's possible, that the comprehensive plan doesn't like. Now, if the thought is, well, let's try to coordinate the timing of this with the zoning action, so that if you look at annexation, if you look at, or even it could be still be consent, it could be either one actually, but you're timing it to know that whatever it is, when the city has a relationship to this property, that if it's already annexed and it'll be zoned, that we time that with the update of the zoning code, or if it's just an agreement and a consent, if that zoning code's in place, so later that if you want to make good on it, you have the ability to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, keep in mind, too, again, without trying to try to prejudge the zoning, generally speaking, cities can't just say, hey, sorry, we don't want that use because we don't have a zoning classification. Generally speaking, we're under an obligation to find a place for it. So in our minds, we can think about what that would be, too, and we know from the contemplation what the options might be. But I want to be careful that we don't want to inadvertently take you down the path of trying to prejudge the zoning, as easy as that actually is in this case to do.
Right.
But so that's why when I look at these two options, 1 and 2, in my opinion, neither look very good unless they're timed up with the what would be the end timing of finalizing the zoning text amendment. And then all your paths lead to, I think all your paths will lead to, at that point, a positive comprehensive plan response. But as Mr. Andrews said, I guess your risk you're taking is that what if the project goes in under the county potentially and can be built? You might choose you never want it. You might never want to hook it up to water at that point. It depends. You may choose you do as well. I don't know and if there's any real significant difference of how it may be built in the county versus how it may be built here. There may be very few, if any, distinguishable differences. But the thought that they could move faster there could cause you to decide, well, maybe that's fine, and we don't want to have any relationship to it whatsoever. Or it might be that's fine, and as long as it turns out the way we all think it would, we can deal with all this later as well.
Right.
But so either way, we need to, and as Dean said, we still need to come up with a cost recovery approach, which is not real difficult. We have some models, but we haven't had a reason to do that here because we really haven't had development demand. A quick history is the first part of the line that's shown here went down Grand Street. That was based on some City Commission approved annexation agreements in the early 2000s. And what happened is those annexation agreements just indicated moving down to the properties on Grand Street. They didn't loop it. So when that came to my attention, when I got here, and there was a desire first to construct what was obligated, so city did that. We're under a contractual obligation. But we looked at it and we said, well, we can't meet fire flow protections with the dead end line, and we have poor water quality. So we said we have to bring that back into the system in order to truly fulfill the fire protection expectation and have solid water quality so we're not flushing the hydrant all the time. So that's what that loop did, and now that's why that loop is in place. So that gives you the history of why we have that loop and why we haven't really had a need to have a structure for the cost recovery aspect of it. But I don't think it's that difficult for us to do that, and I'm kind of contemplating, can we do that in the same time that these other steps are out here? And I think it's possible, but I would want to defer to Greg and Dean on that.
Well, right, and that's why I referred to this map as one of my questions is the only property out there serviced by city water, other than the two agreements that are a little bit south and west of this, other than those two with the agreements, is the only property, is it the Twin Oaks? Is that what's out there?
John, if you want to go to the aerial, back to that aerial photo, please. Okay, this is King Industries. And they were one of the primary reasons for the initial 2006 project, because the owner there had been paying the city for an outside the city fire protection agreement for years and discovered that he had no fire protection. And also, he was trying to establish a daycare for his employees, and he had contaminated wells, and so they would not authorize that as a daycare because of the unsafe water. So the water line put in first assisted with that, then Twin Oaks Industries. It's very hard to see those faint lines, but this property, all of this property here is inside the city limits. Twin Oaks Industries is inside the city limits. All of this property on the other side of the creek is outside the city limits. UPS is here. They have city water, but they have a private line, and so this larger line has benefited their fire protection, and so that is the reason they're in the cost recovery area, because this is an enhancement for them.
So the properties in the cost recovery, only UPS through their private line, King Industries and Twin Oaks are connected into the.
They have already. There was a benefit district created for this part of the line, and King Industries was assessed for that, and Twin Oaks Industries was assessed for that, and they have been paying their assessments for that water line. None of the other properties out there, with the exception of this one here owned by CARE, has been paying for that water line. So the cost recovery was to be set up to help recoup the cost of that line as customers hooked up.
And that cost recovery isn't the same thing as deferred special assessments or whatever, so
No,
that there's no expiration on that.
No.
Okay.
The primary distinction between a cost recovery and a assessment is paid over a period of years, whereas a cost recovery is essentially a hookup charge. It's a one-time fee. So if you could go back to that cost recovery map, John. So this is what Ms. Tasker had put together that said all of these properties are potentially benefited by this Phase 2 extension, and should they hook up, they should pay a cost recovery fee to help recoup the cost of that line. We just have not yet calculated what this property's share is, and we would generally include that in an agreement to see if that was acceptable to the person seeking the agreement, whether they were in agreement with the amount that we had calculated.
Okay. I have a quick question for Mr. Bankson. If we let's just kind of walk this thing through a natural progression. Say we sign the agreement, get a consent to annex. Our decision then would most likely lead to, if we don't really want to provide services without annexation, we would move forward towards annexation with that consent. What does that trigger as far as being responsible for annexing the roadway and being responsible for the long-term maintenance obligations of, because it's fronted on North Street and it's fronted on, we have 2 streets now that we're dealing with. What are the implications of something like that? I mean, what's the likelihood of being noticed up on saying, hey, take care of these? Are you happy that I gave you that question?
Well,
Everybody else is over there.
I believe that is a political question rather than a legal question. And
A state legislature political question?
No,
or?
a Saline County political question at this
Saline County
stage.
one. Okay.
A legal question potentially answered through the pending litigation, but at this point in time, whether there would be an attempt to take that course of action,
Okay.
I think is...
Well, I think it goes to the long-term equation. If you're going to make an agreement for someone to consent to an annexation, sometimes it's hard not knowing what the full cost of actually annexing that would be.
Yeah,
and
that's
that would
correct.
be one concern, is that I'm not sure. I'm sure I could probably recover like the water and if it ends up being a sewer and the fire and all that, should it be brought in and annexed, but not just the road cost, but would it trigger? And this would be a Jason question. Does that trigger? Do we need to then, if we annex that in, bring that up to any city street standard, or can we waive that requirement of ourselves?
No, you're not obligated to bring an existing street up to a city street standard, I wouldn't think. Now, I say that, that's a platting question, I believe.
Okay.
I think I may need to look at Dean on that question. This property does not need to be platted, does it, at this point, Dean?
At this point, the way we were looking at it, and you can, under state law, if you have a property that's outside the city limits and it's zoned, and you bring it into the city, you can bring it into the city on an equivalent zoning basis. A lot of the annexations that we do are agricultural zone property that somebody wants to rezone to residential or commercial. When that occurs, you have annexation, you have a rezoning, and you have a platting. In this case, the property is not platted, but it could be annexed, and annexed with the equivalent zoning that it has in the county without a need for platting or without any need for a planning commission public hearing. It would just be annexed subject to the equivalent zoning that it currently is in the county.
Yeah. So unless it's platted, it doesn't trigger, I don't believe it triggers that minimum, well, the whole and/or minimum street requirement that we have for the
That's part of
infrastructure.
the subdivision regulations.
Yeah, that's part of the subdivision. So as long as it does need to be platted, it doesn't trigger that. Now, even if it did, it may or may not meet the minimum, which we know takes an agreement. But at this point, that's not a contemplation. If the property doesn't need to be platted, it doesn't appear that that single parcel needs to be platted in this case. So I don't think that's an issue for you right now. Coming back to the question that you asked Greg, again, we don't know for sure if Saline County would provide notice to the city on the adjacent roadways. If they did, it does sound like it would be put into the existing list, or at least the result would be the same depending on what happens in the case.
Yes, certainly to be clear for everybody, the state of the law is such that they are, as the statute presently reads, there is a basis for making that request or triggering the process, which would potentially force the annexation of the adjoining roadway. And as you know, the case is pending that addresses our constitutional challenge to that statute. So that's what prompted me to say, I think, could it be? Yes. Would it be? that is up to the discretion of the county commission.
Yeah. And you're going to, at this point, you will have that, as you know, you'll have that probability with, or possibility with any annexed property at this point, that in which you have a non-annexed road adjacent to it.
Okay.
So that's kind of, it is a very good question, and there is a cost to it, but you'll have that same question with every property you might consider to annex. One of the advantages here, a couple things, I mean, that being a commercial property, you're unfortunate for the applicant, but the commercial properties are valued at a higher rate than the residential, so your tax generation from a commercial property is typically higher than a residential, so that's a good thing in this particular case. And then coming back to some of the original questions here, when you look at the consent to annexation, the water agreement with the consent to annexation, that is a good thing, and that's something that we've talked about as a staff and we support. The real question you have here is, do you run ahead of a zoning text amendment, possibly leaving the opportunity for annexation in limbo, or do you try to time it to the best you can with the zoning text amendment? And at that point, the applicant can choose, do I go ahead at this point and do the consent, or do I go ahead and annex? And that's a choice. Either way, we would expect, if it was a consent to annex, and it's built to whatever the county standard is, and there could be some differences in application of the fire code in the county compared to the city and some of those things. Don't know what they are, but there could be. But if it was built and then later the city said, now we're ready to go ahead and exercise our option to bring that property in and annex it and zone it because your zoning text is already going to be in place, I mean, that can work too. It's just a question of the timing, not necessarily whether it's a good or bad idea to go either way, but it's a question of the timing, because the zoning text amendment, if the zoning text amendment for some reason wouldn't satisfy the need of the property, either option 1 or 2, neither one would work at that time for the city. But if it has a timeline. I think, Dean, you indicated it's with the Planning Commission.
October 17th will be the public hearing, and then based on their recommendation, it will advance to the City Commission's agenda around the first part of November.
Okay, so a couple of weeks after that, presumably.
Yeah, okay.
So the question then becomes, whichever of these options you like, if they can be timed to kind of fall in pretty close to the same time and you can move it all forward, that's a good thing, because you have that taken care of. That's really, to me, the issue.
Well, I tell you, I agree. I don't, number 1 and number 2 are, I mean, I don't have a great choice here because of that zoning issue. And I don't want to ask any further questions that I have because they actually pertain to the zoning. And I almost feel like if I start wandering to that territory, I might taint some of the...
Well, the other thing is I've been standing here characterizing what the applicant's goals and desires are, and it would be best if the commission heard from the applicant as opposed to me as to what their goals are related to this project.
Okay, are there any other questions?
I guess my final question would be, and Dean, you don't need to get up again or anything. So the Planning Commission is going to hear this on the 17th. It wouldn't give us enough time to address that at our meeting on the 23rd or the 30th, or no? I mean, it needs more.
I would think the 23rd would be unrealistic, just in terms of getting the minutes and having an adequate report for you. If you do meet on the 30th, that is a possibility.
1, 2,
we can
3, 4.
accelerate
that's
that.
the 5th. All right.
And commissioners, it might take that long, might take longer. I don't want to talk for these two because they would be the ones really drawing up the detail of an annexation agreement, but or a outside water use consent annexation agreement, I should say. But it would likely take at least that long to put that option together anyway. And that's why as I look at these timelines, we have multiple pieces that we could run with, right? So one is an agreement to be outside the city limits, use the water, and consent to annex. Well, that has to be drawn up. And as Dean said, we have to put the methodology together for that line in its entirety. It sounds like a lot. I might be making it sound lighter than it is, but we have done that before, so we have something to start from and work from. So I'm thinking that it may not be that difficult to do, but it will take some time, and it will likely take 2 to 3 weeks or more anyway. So if that process is no quicker than options 1 or 2, trying to bring them together, in my mind, makes sense. And then we can move the project forward in that way.
Does that put the cart in front of the horse, though? I mean, it just seems like
Well,
we're either obligating ourselves to do something or putting
you could
strong
ask us
persuasion
to
on
move-
another group to do something because we've already decided, hey, if you do
Right.
this, we'll do this.
Well, you could request that if let's say on number 2, for example, Direct Pesting Enterprises and the Bighams to submit a request to annex the property into the city limits. So we could request the annexation request from them, and we know what that entails. Okay, first we have a request. At some point, you'd have to address that request. Okay, and then there's a question of, well, we could bring it in, but we don't have a zoning for it at that point in time. So we look at the timing of the zoning action, which we just talked about. What does that mean? If it's annexation, you're going to want to do annexation, you're going to want to establish the zoning, and you're going to want to have the zoning in your code to establish it too. So you're going to want to bring those together to the best degree you can. If it's option 1, the outside the city water and sanitary sewer connection agreement and consent to annexation, that takes time. I don't see that happening overnight. That may very well be a similar timeline that it takes to get the zoning in. And if it is, again, try to align the timelines, and then we can try to the best we can, put that path together to try to align those so that either way you go, the zoning, they'll be lined up with the zoning to the best that they can. Now, the trick to the zoning is once you have the text amendment, it depends where it falls. And again, without presuming that, as was mentioned in the report, we don't know what that property will be zoned officially. We know what it's zoned in the county, and we know historically how we've typically looked at it, but we still would look at all the factors. Would it stay the same in the city or equivalent or not? It may not. Decent chance it might. But we also don't know how in the zoning text amendment this use would be treated. Is it permitted? Is it conditional? If it's permitted, once you vote on the zoning text amendment, if you should vote to support whatever's recommended to you from the Planning Commission, and if that's what it is, zoning set. If it's conditional, they'd still have to go back to the Planning Commission. So that would be the last step, would be to go back to the Planning Commission for that. And again, you would time your action with the other to coincide with when you get the zoning code. You wouldn't run anything ahead of the zoning code, so you don't leave yourself, in essence, naked to the comp plan.
But it seemed if we invited these two entities to submit a request for annexation, I think there would be the assumption that we would rule favorably on whatever conditional use. I mean, that we invited them in. I mean, it would seem kind of foolhardy for us to then 2 months down the road say, no, you can't do that after all.
You don't have to invite anyone to make a request for water, for consent to annex, or to annex. That is their choice at any time. So I don't see any expectation at that point.
Maybe
if you were clear that whatever you're asking us to work with the applicant to do in the process, and then you're also clear, in essence, that you would like those actions to be timed to coincide with the zoning, and what would happen is if they can be on the same meeting, they would be probably after the zoning is what you would do to make sure your zoning's in place first. Or if they're a meeting following, then your zoning would potentially be in place. You wouldn't act on those until the zoning's in place is what would happen. And so we would just try to line them up the best that we can so that you don't predetermine the zoning effect.
With that consent to annex, is it, what is it zoned in the county right now?
IH, heavy industrial.
Okay, so by default, would it come in as that, or would it come in as agriculture?
No, it would come in. It would come in unless you specified differently. It would come in as heavy industrial as part of the annexation.
Okay, and so that would be I3?
Most likely I3.
Okay. And you open the door a little bit, so let me just ask this. Would it be, at that point, I3, so I3 would be completely consistent. We're talking parking requirements, driveway requirements, landscaping, etc., with everything that's around that building. I mean, that's around that property. That's what everything else around there is. So it would be compatible and consistent with that, with the neighborhood.
Everything in that vicinity in the county is zoned heavy industrial.
Okay. So it would pretty much match the thing. Okay. So the only way it would come in something different like a C5 or something like that is that if somebody here said, have it come in as the C5.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Correct.
All right.
Then,
Yeah,
then
I
it
would-
Then I think I said I'm most responsible for having this put on your agenda today, but that's because Ms. Bingham would just like to know. She envisioned after the DRT meeting that she would be doing this as a county project.
Okay.
And if you believe it should be done as a city project, that's really what she needs to know. And if you say it's a city project, then we'll sync up the timing.
Mrs. Bingham.
I am Shelley Bigham. I live at 2216 Leland Way, and I am representing Center Fire Range and Training Center, which will hopefully be at it will be at 1231 West North. He did a very good job of pretty much laying out what's going on. I won't waste too much more of your time. I want to thank you for your time. Basically, I submitted the request back in August, and so I kind of thought by now I would already have this consent of agreement prior to now. So it is a timing thing for us. We're ready for a building permit. We're ready to move now. And to wait even 2 more months, this project's been underway for a year. So we are anxious to move forward. Like he said, just basically our request for water at this time is what we're asking. We are not required based on the square footage and the fact that the range can come out of the building, so we are not required to have a sprinkler system. So as far as fire goes, his referring to fire would be response by the fire department if with the city. Like I said, he pretty much outlined what we're asking. I don't really have anything else to ask, but I can certainly answer any questions that you might have.
Questions?
You know what I kind of do, Ms. Bigham? Do you, when we're talking about this consent to annex,
Correct.
and the way I think we all understand it is that is not necessarily saying we are going to annex.
Correct.
But it would trigger, if I'm kind of looking at both of you here, it would trigger a process by which we would know if it were compatible with something, so we wouldn't have coming in a non-conforming use. What would we do? I mean, because it looks like within other zones in the city.
Yeah, you're either going to leave it out as you're just either not ever going to trigger the annexation part because you don't want it in the city, or you'll have to establish the zone that property would then eventually be zoned to make it compatible, and then you'd annex it and rezone it to that zone.
And I think Mr. Andrews said that there are 2 or 3 other properties out there that have not ever actually been annexed. Is that correct?
Yeah, the city for many reasons many years ago has annexed or had not annexed but provided outside water outside the city limits with consents to annexation on the thought that we would actually execute those, and that's a policy question for the future for a lot of those properties.
Right.
Your current comprehensive plan states you shouldn't do that. That that's really not a good development practice.
Yeah.
And my
It's kind of like
understanding,
which is chicken or the egg. Go ahead.
And my understanding was when we first went to the DRT meeting, and my understanding was I had a couple choices. One was to remain in the remain in the county with no water or sewer. The second was to remain in the county but request relief from city policy. That's where that led me to requesting from the city water, just asking you to deviate from your policy that says you only allow industrial to have water outside the city limits. So that was why I put in the request, because everything I had heard prior to the actual testing of the water was that the water was contaminated. The water was very high in iron and manganese, which that would ruin piping and that kind of thing. Well, I don't want to put in a 15,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility and then have water coming from the well that might potentially ruin such a nice building and what we're trying to do. So that's what led me to request the water. So that's kind of where we're at today. And it has been a long process, but I put in the request in August. So I am here today basically after visiting with Mr. Andrews was that it would be, to present it to you. We understand that there would be a hookup fee. We understand it would be a little bit more on the water side of things as far as cost goes. And I understand that at some point in the future you could ask us then to annex in. I don't have I didn't have a problem with that, and I don't have a problem with that. And so being here today, even though they don't have the particulars, was to see if this request was going to be granted, even though I may have to wait for the legal paperwork to sign. If I knew today walking out of here that you would agree to allow us to go ahead and consent to annex, then I can move forward with putting forth my application for the building permit instead of waiting another 2 months, potentially 3 months, to even be able to seek a building permit.
Okay.
If I could interject a couple things. First of all, I'd like to commend Mrs. Bigham and her husband for the due diligence that they put into this project. It's exceptional compared to other projects we see come through DRT. And as a little bit of clarification, her description of what she was told in DRT about policy and industrial was accurate. Upon further review, our comp plan isn't that specific. It's more open-ended in its approach to extension of utilities outside the city limits. So just so that there isn't any confusion, Mrs. Bigham correctly described what we told her in the DRT meeting about the need for an exception from the industrial requirement. As we look at it, look at the comp plan language, it's more a need for a consent to extension agreement and consent to annexation, which is before you today.
Okay, let me ask you a follow-up question to that explanation. Would that then say we'd be consistent? We could easily be consistent with option, we would be being consistent if we selected option 1 today, but that if we never followed up with that annexation, we'd be inconsistent.
Yes, with one additional clarification. The comp plan does provide for this possibility. In the staff report, there's some decision guidance in the comprehensive plan that Mr. Andrew already touched on, but it's directing new growth to the edges of the existing city limits within identified growth areas, avoiding leapfrog development, continuing to grow outward within identified growth areas, extending infrastructure to serve growth that are immediately contiguous to the community, existing development and existing infrastructure. In this instance, the water infrastructure is already extended. And then lastly, not providing services or extending infrastructure to development outside the city limits that has not been annexed or is not willing to consent to annexation. So the comp plan provides some guidance on a case-by-case basis, determining whether utilities should be extended in areas that are appropriate.
We did this one backwards. We did it the furthest away and then kind of building our way out.
It seems like
the water line extension happened before the comp plan update.
Yeah, in a very real way, this project has all those things you described, and it's infill. I mean, it's an underperforming property because it's developed all the way around it, and it has utilities to it already. It's just not.
Sure. It just runs the risk of being a nonconformity depending on how the text amendment plays out.
So my statement of being that we would be consistent today, but if we never exercise that annexation.
That's correct.
Right.
That's the problem. The end of the line might be inconsistent even with the intent. A factor that's really important is we've talked about the timing, right? So let me ask this. I'm going to put both Greg and Dean on the spot because they'll primarily be putting together. If you think about the process for the agreement for outside city water and the consent, there's a couple aspects to that. First of all, we've done that before, so I presume there's probably a template that we would use, review, possibly modify a little bit. Probably not too big of a deal. Fill in some blanks mostly. However, since we don't have a cost allocation yet with that water line, you have to have that, and it's going to be referenced in the agreement. So we have to come up with the methodology. Again, I don't think that's reinventing the wheel, but often when you get into those things, it's not exactly how you did it before. Sometimes there's refinements or nuances you have to deal with. So realistically, and we think of putting together that complete cost recovery, which, by the way, you have to approve formally, and usually that's in an ordinance form, I believe, cost recovery ordinance, on a traditional timeline, preparation, all the staff review, legal review, to you, first reading, second reading, publication, and then following up with the agreement on the outside water and consent to annex. How much time do you think that actually takes in a reasonable time frame? Dean and Greg, you guys have dealt with that enough. I'm thinking that you can, depending on where the text amendment goes, you may have it in place by the time that's ready. And and the timelines would almost naturally fall together. That's why I keep talking about meshing the timelines, because I think you would.
The agreement yourself, you're correct. The template has been used and is pretty tried and true template. The biggest gap I ran into was the paragraph that deals with the connection fee and either being able to provide a number for that or a basis for that. I will defer to Greg. I believe that we could, if we characterized it as a hookup fee or something else, we could calculate whatever the amount applied to this property and execute it through a cost recovery mechanism later. But the other aspect is the which I can eventually figure out is the legal description, and part of that is it is not concerned to the policy question, but from 1887 to 1936, a good part of this property was inside the city limits, and it is platted, and it's part of the Chicago addition to the city of Salina. But when the channel of Dry Creek changed, the city limit line changed, and so the city limit line moved from the old channel to the new channel, leaving part of an addition to the city outside the city limits. And so that has been part of the issue of just constructing an adequate description to even make a title company happy. So.
Sounds like Oakdale Park.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. And so there's some logistical pieces, not necessarily policy pieces, but logistical pieces of work that have to be done to get number one ready, and that's going to take some time. And so the zoning takes some time. Which one takes the longer time? I'm not sure, but this is going to take a little bit of time to put together, and you could possibly have your zoning ready. If the zoning's going to the Planning Commission on the 16th, you get, say, the first meeting in November, theoretically, and depending on what that outcome is, the zoning could be established in the code at that point in time. And if it is permitted, there's no other action left on the zoning, then everything else can follow just as quick as it's ready. And you're not talking that many weeks out when we're talking about preparation of the work we just talked about here. So that's why I feel that the timing, I could be wrong. I really wouldn't expect the preparation of that agreement and the cost recovery methodology to be ready any quicker or much quicker than the zoning route. It could, but I really wouldn't expect it. Now, if you said put everything else down, we're not going to do anything else planning or legal in that time, sure, it could be ready a little bit quicker. But I presume you're going to look at still balancing your typical activities and trying to get it done in a reasonable time. Yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. I can defer to Greg on that as well. But I'm not so sure you have a timing conflict here necessarily with any of these options, and you can still concentrate on the zoning piece getting finished.
Okay. Let me tell you where I am, and if you can help me, because I'm still kind of trying to piece things together. I think staff can kind of help me get to where I think I want to be on this. While I understand that there are a number of things about annexing, and I want to state emphatically, if this comes in with city services, I want it to be annexed. Okay. Now, if that's a matter of timing or whatever that is, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm fine with one or two. I like the fact that, and it means a lot to hear from Mr. Scragg that this is a well-considered project and they've fulfilled all the requirements of the DRT. I'd like to see them be able to move forward with this project. I just want to make sure that if two is the way to go, that achieves what one does and it's in the best interest of the applicant. I mean, we're here to help serve them. That's what I'd kind of like to get. But I'd also like the applicant to know with eyes wide open that there probably will be an expectation that annexation consent would be exercised. I certainly won't be here at that time, but it probably could be, would you say, a matter of 6 months to a year or even less?
Right, we could even put it probably a time frame for which we would exercise it in the agreement if we wish to, I would think. So, absolutely, I would not even ask you to consider that if you didn't desire to fairly immediately annex it, whether it be during or just after construction completion or some reasonable date.
Right, and I say that only because I would assume that most any board it'd be hard to get to a majority vote that says let's don't annex it. So I'm kind of stuck in that place as I want to see you guys move forward on it, but in a fashion that going into it that there may be some long-term obligations that that could be triggered to it. And I could be wrong. It could never be annexed. So,
And part of the point in the timing is that on the ability, I get the ability to get a building permit as quickly as possible to get started on the project. Makes good sense. I presume that can't be done on the county side simply with direction today that says, hey, bring us back something to consider later. I believe it'd probably have to be done once the consent is in place. Now, I don't know that. That might be a choice they have on that side and a risk that they take as well on that side. I don't know that. But generally speaking, even on number one, you're not done until you approve the methodology and the agreement. Then you're done at that stage. And so if that takes 3 weeks or 4 weeks, that's when the city's done, and at that point the applicant knows it's good to go from our side. So that's why I'm still talking about when we know the timeline of the zoning and we know this could easily take three weeks or more.
I'm looking,
maybe not a lot more, but easily 3 weeks to get
boil
ready.
this down. I'm looking for one or two being which is the path of least resistance for the applicant.
Yeah.
Commissioners, could I have just a moment with staff?
Sure.
I think it'll take just a minute, if that's all right, if we could step out.
Commissioner Davis, I want to publicly apologize for shooting my rubber band down your way. I lost control. It came out of my hand, and I almost broke up with laughter. So I apologize.
I thought I was hallucinating at first when I saw this thing drop down here. I said, well, no, mine is still around here. And
Just so everybody, I'm attempting here that so we don't tempt ourselves to talk amongst ourselves off mic. So while staff is away. So anyway.
First, I didn't know if you were trying to reach the clerk, and so I looked down at her and said, I think he wants your attention.
Oh. Anyway, I don't know if that startled you. I think it flew right over Carl's head. So
Good thing we switched chairs today.
Oh, Madam Mayor.
I'm on the floor. I'm on the board.
You're on the floor. Madam Mayor, I will have one very quick item under other business that I forgot to mention to you before.
I guess I am to assume purple is the ribbon color for
That's
domestic abuse prevention?
Well,
Or
I think
does
it's
anyone know?
also for, well, maybe it is just domestic violence. I thought it was
Does any,
cancer.
I did.
or do you know?
Yeah, I did too.
I think that's lavender. I think that's more of a lavender instead of like a royal purple.
Well, maybe it is.
But you know what? I just have to say, Melissa, you look really good with purple on.
Well, I tell you what, the sun will come up tomorrow. When they debuted those Fafer Cure shirts, and it was like purple.
I
don't have any of that in my wardrobe.
I would suggest not letting Boo see that.
Who wore one?
Oh.
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
I want a picture of that.
Yeah.
You wore that on your wall, didn't you?
We did. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I meant the purple ribbon. Lavender's fine. He's okay. I'm not going to give him grief with lavender.
Okay. Well, see if I can sneak it onto his lab coat and see if
There
he
you go.
notices.
It looks as though there's another hot dog cooking opportunity in some of their programming.
Okay. I'm going to enter some dates into my calendar. They got a lot going on.
They do.
Oh my gosh.
It's kind of nice that she printed up these flyers. They're nice.
Yeah. Oh, I like the idea of a candlelight vigil. got a parking ticket when we get out. There weren't any places except for the 1 hour.
You're right. We got hot dogs at this event. Is there another one with hot dogs?
Is this a woodshed event?
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. It did take a little longer than anticipated. I would have suggested maybe you recess it. I known it was going to take that
take a
period of
while.
time. So, but I do appreciate it, and thank you very much. And
Okay, I'm going to bring this back to the commission. I think we've talked about it long enough. It's the commission's pleasure.
Did we determine a path of least resistance? I thought maybe that's what you guys went out there for.
Right. Yeah, I did too. I was hoping you were going to come back with a really brilliant solution that satisfies everyone.
To the applicant's credit, she wasn't in a position at the time that she talked with us to anticipate the zoning text amendment being a part of this, okay? It did come up from a different party, which is fine. We should have been on top of that at the time. But the thought being is it is going to take time to get a proper legal description to fill in that blank. It's going to take time to come up with a methodology. It's going to take time to then draw up the annexation or the connection of water and outside the city and consent to annexation agreement. So all those things are going to take time. Right now, we're talking about the zoning coming back to you probably in 4 weeks. That's what approximately. First meeting in November, maybe slightly shy of that. I can't remember when the dates fall. I can definitely see it taking that long to finish this piece up because there's a little bit of work on that methodology. And we have a baseline to work from, but there's going to be some work in doing that. So I can see it taking that much time. So your options are, do you go in with option number 1 blindly, not knowing at all if in fact you'll have zoning that could potentially fit the property, and if you're okay with that, that would be nonconformity with the comp plan if that would happen. It's not a high risk, I don't believe. If I'm going to categorize it, I think it's a fairly low risk, honestly, but it's still a potential risk that you would at some point not be in conformance with the comp plan. You could go with 2, and there's no question with 2, you're going to have the zoning in place because once you annex, you got to annex it to some use, right? So you need to have the zoning in place. So 2's going to, I think 2 pretty much causes you to follow the zoning anyway. But you could sync up 1 with the zoning as well and say, we don't want to act on 1, get it ready, and then make sure that timing coincides with the zoning. Or you could just go on 1 blindly. But again, if you go with option 1 blindly, you have to acknowledge that there's a possibility, without prejudging the zoning, that property is using city water and is never annexed into the city because there's not a zoning that it would be compatible with. So it stays outside.
Let me ask you,
It's what your comp plan doesn't want you to do is to keep adding properties outside the city limit and providing water.
Right.
So there's a small chance you could be there. I truly don't think it's a big chance, but there is a chance.
So from a timing perspective, because we keep talking about that zoning component, a consent to annex is the trigger for allowing the water.
Yes.
Okay. The comp plan says on a consent to agenda to service water. I mean that's consistent with that comp plan.
I think your comp plan is fine with consent to annexation to provide water outside the city limits if all other aspects are met. And I think in this case, we can talk about the comp plan. I think they are, or at least it appears that they are.
Right. And
so,
then,
yeah.
but with the consent, like as far as the relationship between zoning and a consent to annex versus an application to annex.
But yeah, because your consent will eventually, it doesn't need to be an application. Both an application and a consent leads to your action as a governing body to annex property, right? And when you annex property, you have to establish a zone for the property. Okay, so the risk is that for whatever reason, that through the zoning text amendment process, that it happens, but if there's any possibility that it wouldn't benefit this property, you're stuck with the property you can't annex at the time. It has city water and it sits outside the rest of the time. Like I said, I believe that's a very small likelihood, but it's technically a likelihood. The question is do you want to act on the probability of not complying with your zone or your comprehensive plan, or does it matter to you? If it doesn't matter to you, you can go ahead with one and move forward, and then we'll kind of take our chances on the zoning. Like I said, likelihood is pretty good that you won't run into trouble, but there are no guarantees because it hasn't happened yet and we can't prejudge it.
Right, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear, because the consent, is the agreement in there to provide water the main part? It's the main part of the thing. If it's not annexed, it's that agreement.
Yeah,
is the
they
governing
get water.
document.
What the agreement would basically say is that we'll have the methodology, would reference the methodology so that the applicant knows what the cost is. That's pretty important too, because you don't want that surprise. And in essence, it provides for the means to hook up legally and fairly and immediately, for the most part, when they're ready to. Generally, and it says in exchange for that, if we want to annex ever, we can do that. It's up to you just to pretty much take the action at that point. They don't have to apply later. It's there. It's given to us.
Is that agreement to supply water can it be a conditional negotiated thing that if you have some concerns about whether it comes in as a certain thing, that there might be some compatibility?
You mean in a way that you could take away water later if the rest doesn't happen?
No.
Okay.
That
that would be bad, by the way.
You could, right. Yeah. There could be certain things there that might be objectionable. Should it be annexed? That you say, boy, I really wouldn't want you to do this because it could cause problems if it's
Remember,
annexed.
it's just a consent. It's not an obligation annex.
Right.
So you could always decide not to annex it if you want to. Now, again, providing water to a property outside the city without annexing would still be a violation of your comp plan. If something along the way came and you said, well, we don't want this property in our city no matter what,
right.
I guess you can weigh that and say, well, I guess we made a mistake on that at one point, but maybe it's a bigger mistake later to bring it in. I don't know.
Well, let me just give you an
It's your
example,
option
and
at that point.
this in no way is where I want to go with this thing. It's actually in the opposite direction. But if I said part of the agreement to supply that water with a consent to annex would be that, you know what, we really want you to pave the parking lot.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just saying, can we condition it on that so that should we annex it and we say we don't want to have it in it with a gravel parking lot if everybody else is going to be paved.
Yeah.
I'm just saying those kind of conditions so that we can say, are there things that might be objectionable for it not to be, if it were to be annexed? And can we get out in front of those things? Or like if there's a difference between the state fire code and the city's fire code, you go with the city's fire code, those types of things. Yeah, just exactly. So we can safeguard ourselves that if it never gets annexed, we're covered with that anyway.
Sure. It's a good question. I think that's one for Greg.
Offhand, Commissioner, that would seem to fall as a parallel to a conditional use.
Okay.
And I think we're working our way into what is a substitute for a conditional use zoning process, which, as you know, gets us into a contractual zoning arrangement. And that's problematic.
I know, but I was just taking a run at it.
You had me fooled on that one.
Yeah, well, I thought maybe I'd figured something out there, but I guess I hadn't. So, okay.
Have we discussed this enough?
So are we two or one?
Are we ready for?
It's totally up to you because,
motion?
like I said, one, you have to at this point assume you might not have a zoning classification you can use. As I mentioned, I think that's a low likelihood. But you always have to assume that, and the reason is because the zoning's not in place yet. So that would be with any property in the same situation. Zoning's not in place. Will it be in place to benefit the property later?
Okay.
Don't know for sure. Don't know 100%.
Well, Madam Mayor, if you want me to help get us off the mark, I'm going to go with the last statement that with the low likelihood approach there.
Number 2 is what I'm thinking.
And Well, I was going to kind of go with that number one with the low likelihood part. Let me throw that out there, and at least if nobody seconds this, we can move on to a different option. But, Madam Mayor, I would move to direct staff to prepare and finalize an outside of the city water and sanitary sewer connection agreement and consent to future annexation with Pestinger Enterprises and Mick and Shelley Bigham, DBA, Center Fire Range and Training Center. Did I leave anything out of that I should have? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
I'll second.
Okay, have a motion and a second to finalize an outside the city water and sewer connection agreement and consent to future annexation with Pestinger Enterprises and Mick and Shelley Bingham.
One last question for Mr. Gage. You'd mentioned the possibility of inserting the language to talk about matching up schedules with option number one. Is that a possibility, and would you consent to amending your motion to include that?
Say that again. I was drinking.
What's the amendment?
That we
Syncing
would,
up the...
that we would have staff sync the schedules together in terms of the pending zoning ordinance text and the cost recovery and all the other things that we're going to be moving forward with to try to bring them all together at the same time.
I'm going to look at Greg a little bit on the language here, and I would say there's probably two pieces. One is this asking us to practically to try to sync the timelines up as close as we can. The second piece would be, and there's a few ways you could handle this, the thing, but not to bring the final action on the agreement until either at or, well, for that action to occur after the zoning action is in place, which could be the same meeting. You can move stuff around. It could be the same meeting, or it could be a meeting or two later.
Would I be correct in assuming that you would like me to amend my motion to strike the word finalize, to just direct staff to prepare an outside of the city agreement?
May I interject a question of the applicant, Ms. Bingham? Do you know when you would expect to have a surveyed legal description of the property?
No, I don't have an exact date. They've been summoned probably 4 weeks ago.
Sure.
And I don't know whether they've actually been out there yet or not. I know that the deed, in my understanding, if I'm correct, is there's legal description. Unfortunately, the way it's described, it's done by subtraction, and they can't just figure out what this legal description is just for the North Street part. So that seems to be our hang-up.
Well, and the only reason I ask, I mean, there are a number of components, and if I'm understanding the objective, it's, okay, staff, do everything to be sure that all aspects are ready as soon as the zoning question can be resolved.
If
Is
that's
that
a possibility, right?
Well, I'm looking to Dean, but I think that should be. One question that we do need to clarify is, and Martha's not here by virtue of being at another city-related commitment, but there is the question of even whether that component, whether we have some bonding in the picture as we look at the cost recovery and the extent to which we would need to consult with bond counsel on the calculation of the allocation. That sort of thing. I mean, I think as I'm looking to Dean to make sure I'm not suggesting things that we can't suggest or can't take care of, but
There's
I
a
would
lot of
think
moving parts.
we're going to need the, am I correct, Dean, that we're going to need the surveyed legal description to ultimately take these actions?
Have it run with the land and properly attached to the right parcel. We need to have a surveyed legal description. We also need to that because if we're going to take a front footage or a square footage cost recovery approach, we need to know what the square footage of this parcel is so we can properly allocate.
And if I'm understanding maybe the way you all are going, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it's okay, we understand the situation, you all understand the situation, and we know the path that the zoning question is on, and that the expectation of staff and the applicant and everybody involved is, okay, everybody, we know when the zoning's coming in. We want to be able to act on this on behalf of the applicant the moment we know the zoning, resolution of the zoning matter, so that everything can be done in the meantime to make sure that you all are positioned to act. And there are several components of that I don't know that we need to catalog right now, but I just mentioned two of them.
I think I'd rather do it correctly than quickly. If we're talking a week here, then I understand the reason to move forward, but what happens if the zoning issue cannot be resolved?
Well, that's a good question. You have a choice at some point to approve the agreement, recognizing that at least at this time, it may not comply with your comprehensive plan, or not to approve the agreement. And I think you got to be careful here, because when you say direct staff to prepare, finalize, you're meaning to bring it to you for action. That doesn't obligate you to action. That may mean that today, in your mind, you think it's a good idea, and you're leaning towards it. But at that time, you look at all the factors and then choose.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let my motion stand as originally stated. And one of the reasons, just for clarification, is that I've always had the expectation and generally been delivered on that staff is going to give best efforts to coordinate and work towards with the client in a manner of good customer service to get this thing done. So,
for formality's sake, and this is I appreciate that. Commissioner Hodges, if you want to really try out your amendment, you could actually make it as a motion to amend his motion and then carry it through. And if the amendment carries, then it attaches to that motion. If it doesn't, then it doesn't attach to it. That's a choice you have just procedurally.
Thank you. I think we'll let the motion stand.
There you go. Okay.
I just still, every week we keep making exceptions to our comp plan. And if it's so weak that we can shoot a hole through it every week, we really need to either scrap it, redo it.
Yeah, I don't think
we're going to adhere to it. I mean, it's. And the other question I have: if the zoning issue does not turn out favorably, is this wasted effort? We'd then have to go to 2 anyway. In that you'd have no teeth in having consent.
I guess there's a legal question. If you don't have the proper zoning code, it's a question for Greg. I don't know if there's a place you can put it if you annex without the proper zoning for it. If you annex, you get to collect taxes, obviously, so there's some benefit to annexation. But I can't fathom that there's a place it could be put without creating the proper zoning category.
That would be correct.
Yeah, so I thought so, but I thought I'd better check.
Yeah.
So what that means is you wouldn't annex it. You would be if the zoning falls apart or for whatever reason can't benefit this property, then you would never annex the property. You would simply be providing water at a slight surplus, in essence, in perpetuity, without having that in your city, in essence, in violation of your current comprehensive plan. That's what would happen in that scenario.
we'd be charging for water that's already passing right in front of this property anyway.
Right.
Right.
It's going right by it,
Yeah.
but
Then the policy needs to be changed. Or, I mean, we're sitting here we would be doing something that
Or
our
to annex
policy
the
says,
property.
The reason
well,
your
we can't
compre-
annex it because there's
Well,
no place to
The
put
reason
it.
your comprehensive plan talks so much about utilities is because roads and utilities are the catalyst for development.
Right.
And it relates those, if they are a catalyst for development, then the question is, do you want to control the quality of that development? And that's why it addresses those. But that's a question for you guys to deal
And
with.
on this, the utilities are there,
Yeah.
the
And-
exception of the sanitary sewer.
But it doesn't say except in situations when the
Well,
utilities
no, it
are
doesn't,
there.
but I think what it does is that's why it gives you a lot of policy questions within that comp plan, and it gives you triggers that say, is it contiguous? Is it
Right.
part
And
of
the
this?
advantage to
Are
that
the
is
utilities already there?
You can
Are they in
anticipate
time?
that property would be annexed, so you can collect the taxes. If that becomes a theoretical improbability, then you're just selling water.
Well, and I think I prefaced the whole thing with saying it would be I'm assuming that you're probably going to have commissions that will exercise that consent to annex. So that's why I asked the applicant if, is that, having that likely be a potential outcome, is that something that is doable? And so that's why I'm there. I mean, if I thought that it wasn't ever going to happen, I probably...
Is it improper to ask for an opinion regarding the likelihood of there not being a zoning resolution?
I think that pretty clearly is a bit of a prejudgment on there. But like I said, if you look at the information that you have in front of you, you know what it's zoned in the county. And Mr. Andrews talked about, generally speaking, if the compatibility factors are there, what prior commissions have done, see, that didn't prejudge you in the future, but what prior commissions have done with the zoning. So that's why I say I think it's a low probability, but I don't know that. And it may depend on what the zoning is, too, because if the zoning is a permitted use, it's a much easier question for going further. If the zoning is a conditional use and conditions are considered, we can't anticipate what those are or what application, how those might be applied to the property. Those make it a little different decision. So that's why it's probably legally best and practically best not to prejudge the zoning, because we don't know for sure just simply because it hasn't happened.
Right.
So, but there is always a possibility, high, low, whatever, I think it's low, that the property might not benefit from zoning and you're stuck with a property that gets city water. And there are a lot more if we could do more, but would have city water and would never annex into the city. It's always a possibility. That's about all that's as much as I can tell you, really.
So that would be an acceptable form of community development?
There is a consent. Here's the thing.
There
is a consent.
Just as far as our approach to developing on the fringe, would that be an acceptable?
I think I'm going to tell you something. I find it interesting that you would ask that, because we annexed about 104 acres for an expo center out in the county that wasn't really adjacent to anything, and extended utilities out to it. And quite frankly, I was opposed to that because it was not. But this one, you have utilities, you have all these things. I think, as the city manager says, there's a low probability of, having happen what you don't want to have happen. And these folks got a business ready to go. They've got things already on the line.
That part,
and it's not part of my decision, but I'm just saying that I think it leads to that judgment. There's a low probability that, it's not gonna happen the way that it would be most advantageous to happen. I think it'll get annexed in.
well, this is, it's attractive. I agree with you. The water's already there. I'm just suggesting that at some point we look at
And I appreciate that.
our comprehensive plan. If parts of it are outdated, then we need to.
I can tell you this. I don't think that part is outdated, but I think that you do have considerations that come from time to time, and one of them is text amendment, and the other one's map amendments. As far as a map amendment goes, I don't know if this isn't just logically, as Mr. Andrews said, it was actually in the city at one time.
Well, as I tried to indicate in my report and is depicted on this map, the purple areas are future employment areas, which anticipate those being zoned for industrial use. So bringing this property into the city limits and zoning it industrially would be consistent with the comprehensive plan. It would not be contrary to the comprehensive plan.
I have a motion and a second to direct staff to prepare and finalize an outside the city water and sewer and sanitary sewer connection agreement and consent to future annexation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. We have another motion, and the city clerk will have to read that motion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That you made,
Oh,
unless you want to withdraw the motion. You made another motion?
no.
Are you,
She-
Oh, no, I asked.
She was going to
Suggested
amend the
amending, but
motion.
Yeah, and then I
And did
withdrew it.
Yeah.
Oh, you withdrew it?
Yeah.
I
Okay,
did.
that's
I did.
Yeah, I think we're
withdrawn.
I
clean.
did.
Okay.
I did.
Okay.
It was getting kind of confusing in here.
Well, yes,
Well,
yes,
hey,
we spent an
thank
hour
you.
on that.
Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Bingham, for
thank
being
you.
so patient.
No, thank you.
Okay, we're on to other business, and Commissioner Hodges.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was at an Equality Kansas meeting a couple of weeks ago, and a citizen brought forth a suggestion that I thought was a great one. And he's here today, Gary Martins, and his husband, Larry Bunker. Back in 2012, as I'm sure you remember, we had the anti-discrimination ordinance pass. And forgive me if I'm getting all this wrong, because I was running late and I left my notes up in my car. At any rate, I was wondering if there would be any kind of consensus within the commission to review our employee manual and our HR policy statements to include the language that was included in the original ordinance. I understand that the ordinance was rescinded, but at the same time, when I was looking for guidelines online, that language is included in SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resources Managers, to include gender identification and sexual orientation. And I thought it might be a good time to bring this back and take a look if we could at least incorporate that into our own policies and be a community leader in terms of recognizing diversity.
Was my understanding we couldn't do that for 10 years. Am I incorrect about that?
Commissioners, I believe that what Commissioner Hodges is talking about is specific to the city as an organization and our own business policies. The ordinance in question was dealing with regulating the rest of the community and what they do in their private policy. So I look at our attorney, but I believe you have the authority, if you wish, to modify our policies for our organization.
Policy,
yes.
And the 10 years was with respect to the rest of the community?
To us regulating the community.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah. With that said, if you want to, we have many contemplations we'll have to go and discuss and probably report back at some point, just so you know, but that'd be part of the process.
Okay.
Jason, when that happened last time, was that something that was contemplated and then turned down by the existing commission, or was it something, because the existing commission actually voted in favor of that ordinance, and then it was overturned by a vote. So
correct.
Was the whole thing overturned, or was there just one component? Was it just the public component, or was there never a component to consider it as a city policy?
That's a good question. At the time of that component, I don't believe there was a component to address that as a city policy, because you, in essence, you would just been updating your policy if that would have passed and been sustained by the public. Now, after that, I do recall, and I'll need to check the record, I do recall the topic being brought up by former Commissioner Householder at the time, I believe. I honestly don't know if it was just a brief conversation or if there was anything formally put in front of the commission to vote on. But I do believe, I could be wrong on that, and which commissioner, but I think it was brought up. I don't recall if there was a vote or if it was just a conversation. We'd need to go back and check the record to be sure.
Okay.
Yes, would you look into that for us? And I think the commission would agree at least to look into that issue.
I don't have any objection.
It was what?
Back at the time that you removed it from the city's policies.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you better this way.
Gary Martins, 821 Highland Avenue. From my understanding, what my recollection was, when the election was held, or the vote was held, and the ordinance was repealed, then at the next city commission meeting, and I wasn't here, I was out of town, but the next city commission meeting, then it was brought to the commission to have it removed, a vote to remove it from the human relations policy and
I don't remember.
That's what I understood, because I can't remember. I had the vote count at that time. At that time, it was voted. I know when it passed, you originally approved the ordinance. It was passed by the commission 3-2. Then the election was held, and it was reversed.
Right.
And then the removing from the human relations policy, or whatever you call it, your policies and procedures manuals,
the ordinance,
was again 3-2, with one person going over to the other direction to have it removed.
Right.
So is my recollection.
And
Yeah, we can
But-
verify.
but that could all
Yeah,
be
I don't-
verified, yeah.
I
that's
don't
just-
recall. Been too long ago.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, but
I-
we can look
I-
into it.
I recall a little bit of that. I'm not quite sure of the details, though.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not
Could I
sure
just
either.
add also, one of the reasons I think it's important to add that in is that since that time, marriage is legal across the land.
Right.
And so by simple virtue of somebody exercising the right to be married, then they can, but it's logic defies that you can be married, but then you come to work Monday and be fired.
Right, right.
Because of who you are. So,
Exactly, right.
Right?
And I want to
Yeah.
thank you for bringing this to my attention. I really appreciate it, Gary.
Okay.
Mr. Gage, I just have a quick question. Is this something that you would take at the staff level and then task that through the Human Relations Department for a recommendation prior to bringing it back to City Commission? What would I guess I'm asking you, what would the process of that look like?
That's a good question. I would need to go back through and look at their ordinance. I can't recall if that's one of the objectives in their ordinance or in the ordinance or not. If it is, you certainly would want to honor that. If it isn't, you still could use the Human Relations Commission. If it's not in the ordinance as one of the objectives or duties or purposes, then it's just a choice. We'd probably refer to you if you would wish to do that.
You're talking about the ordinance of the policy,
Yeah.
The ordinance.
enforcing the, or,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, to apply
Okay.
that type of protection. I think the issue is, for example, it mentioned marriage, and marriage in itself is one piece of it, and benefits that relate to that. There are many other pieces that deal with accommodations of employees and other working aspects that we would need to look at too, because you may have, if it's 100% application, there could be things you haven't contemplated. If it's a more strategically pointed application, it's a little different. So what we would do is look at and say, what are all the possible applications that would have and contemplations you might have to have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Hodges.
Thank you, Mayor.
And Commissioner
Madam Mayor,
Davis.
move the city commission recess into executive session.
Real quick, before you do that, I'm waiting to see, you probably want to, on this one, want to be clear as a group and tell us, would you like us to spend time to do that? And if so, what's your time frame for wanting to have something in front of you for either in a study session format or a formal format to vote on?
Well, I've been asking you to spin straw into gold all day now. Is next week too soon? No. What's a reasonable time for you to research this and feel like you have a good handle on it? Or staff?
That's a good question. Again, by itself, the question is going to be looking at and say, what would it touch as far as the everyday things we do and how those things affect, in essence, the rights of our employees. So that's a legal piece over that would fall into Greg's side, and I don't know how long that would take. And then once we know that, then we can bring contemplations to you, say, this is what we believe it would do or could do. Are you comfortable? And then that helps us refine and would put that together. And I'm thinking that would take a few weeks. However, as we look between now and the end of the year, we're going to be working on, just to give you an idea, of capital improvement planning, special assessments, right? Remember that one?
Yes, we remember that one.
That's a big task right there, the special assessments. And there's some other things we'd like to do to finish up as well, some agreements and things. So I'm not sure I can tell you. What I need to know from you is how big a priority is it before the end of the year.
Can I ask a question first that might kind of help that? Is that in order to maybe expedite any sort of thing, save staff time and everything and so on, and not reinvent the wheel? If I heard correctly, there was already some sort of action in line, and so I would think that during that whole process of the of that issue as it went through, that a lot of these things were kind of tasked through, and then at the end it sounded like it was just kind of decided that that wasn't going to be voted on, or whatever was asked. Is it possible to maybe kind of let this one go till next week when we can find out, is there already work product existing, and is it something as simple as just bringing us something that somebody took a pass on last time?
Yeah, we could certainly check on that and just report back next week and then give you a chance to think through it and see what you want to do.
Yeah,
that'd be good.
Because
that'd be good.
I appreciate
because
the fact
it's
that you got
been
a lot of
long
stuff
enough
to do.
ago. I don't remember
Right.
exactly what went on. To tell you the truth, so but yeah, if you could do that, that would be great. Okay, Commissioner Davis.
All right.
Can I just say something in other business real quick?
No,
I just want to recognize staff effort on something, and that is I appreciate City Manager Jason Gage getting together with the school superintendent last week and showing a real good show of support on taking care of some really delicate community efforts, and I really appreciate that you really stepped up and have got I know they got some meetings going on today and a process underway. Not quite sure what that is, but I just want to express my gratitude for your.
We did that at the chamber meeting, didn't we, Jason?
I appreciate that. And as you know, we have a great working relationship with USD 305 and the other entities that we partner all the time. And I know they would do the same for us and offer any assistance that they could provide. So appreciate that.
Right.
And I've been in touch with Sandy Beverly and some of the staff from the Human Relations Department. Okay, Commissioner Davis.
Last chance. No, I'm just asking.
Last chance.
Madam Mayor, move the City Commission recess into executive session to discuss contract negotiations with legal counsel pursuant to the attorney-client privilege communications with legal counsel exception, KSA 45-7319B2 for 45 minutes. The open meeting will resume at this room, in this room at 7:05.
I have a proposition for you, Commissioners, before you second that. The proposition is we have two topics. One could take quite a while. It's not so pressing that it has to happen this week. It could happen at your next meeting. The question is when do you want to get out tonight?
Right. What time is kickoff?
7:30.
So
Let's get our
So
business done.
on the
Let's get our
assumption you're
business
okay
done.
waiting on the one topic, and there, like I said, it's not a pressing time frame that we can't wait a week. We could probably be done in 15 minutes.
Well, it's 6:20.
It's up to you. I just want to make
I'd
sure
like to
you
get
know
them
that
both
you have
done.
some flexibility there with the time you take.
I'm sorry, Dr. Davis. Don't look at me like that. I'm sorry.
He's the one making the motion. Nobody has to second it.
Are we going to vote on this?
Well, I mean, so we could do both topics within an hour or within 45 minutes?
I wouldn't put my money on it. That would be the target.
Just from a procedural perspective, the second topic could be continued to another.
Certainly can.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not we don't have to
think
talk
that would
about
be
it
good.
tonight.
Yes.
It's not pressing. The first topic is pressing. The second topic is not.
So we'll keep the original 45 minutes.
Give it a shot.
And reconvene at 7:05.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign.
I was really close to the opposed this time, just so you know. Really close to a no vote on that one. So last time we had a 4-1 vote on a special executive session.
I should not have worked so hard on my house.
Commissioners, for the benefit of the public, we do not anticipate any action when we come out of executive session.
My brother went back, so I really got into cleaning.